The American Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991, in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape number 26A. Please excuse the small delay at the start of this tape.
Good morning. This is the workshop entitled Abuse and Adoption for any of you who find that it's very early in the morning and you wandered to the wrong spot. We will certainly excuse you. I think this is an extremely difficult topic to talk about, and why someone thought 8:30 in the morning was a good idea, I'm certainly not sure. My name is Deborah Silverstein. I'm an adoptive parent and a licensed clinical social worker. I work primarily in the field of adoption and abuse-related issues. I see both children and adults. I'm going to introduce the panel just by name, and when they get to talk, we're going to let them introduce themselves rather than my making a mess out of that. Over here we have Elizabeth Ann, and next to her, her birth mum. I've learned to say that correctly, I hope, Sarah. And here's Danielle, and down here is Mim. And they will be talking to you after I give a little opening. We're going to talk a little bit about adoption and why perhaps abuse is occurring in adoption. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've rewritten and researched and looked at this material, and I was having trouble figuring out what my trouble was. Until actually yesterday when I got here, and you know the energy of a group and so forth, and I was thinking a lot about it and realizing that one of the difficulties is that in so many ways adoption is itself abusive. That the institution, the way we practice it, the things that happen to people are very painful. And I think we're all going to have a little difficulty today differentiating and staying on the specific topic of abuse in adoption and not getting into the abuse of the system of adoption. And I think that that's something that we're going to artificially do in making that distinction. But clearly, for the folks who are abused, there is no such distinction. But let's try to focus in on what maybe society, who doesn't know anything about adoption, would say was abuse. So we're going to look at what happens in adoption and what happens in abuse, and then what happens when those two occurrences come together. I began this undertaking not voluntarily. I was conscripted to do the workshop, and I said okay, as I do in my weaker moments, only to then figure out that there is almost no written material out there, that very few people in the system of adoption are willing to talk about it. It's not supposed to happen, right? What we've told birth parents, what we've told adoptive parents, is that this system called adoption is a really good thing. And it takes children from those awful, terrible people called birth parents and puts them into a home with those wonderful, wealthy, professional, terrific, what else can I tell you, adoptive parents. That's the myth. That's the belief underlying adoption. I want to be clear from the beginning that we must be careful when we talk about abuse and adoption not to go from that myth of it never ever happens to everybody is abused in adoption. And I think that that's an easy flip that could occur. We don't know. We need research. We need folks to explore this issue. It's unknown if abuse in adoption is more prevalent or less prevalent than in the non-adopted population. A lot of people that I talk to feel that it is in fact more common and more underreported, kept a secret. Why not? Adoption is a secret, and it has been that way. But I want to put on my clinical hat and say to you, let's not rush into something without getting some statistics, some information, and be reasonable and be believable when we talk with other folks about these problems. Certainly the myth has been that abuse doesn't occur at all. And our panelists here today are to begin the dialogue to say, yes, it does happen. We're supposed to be rescuing those poor little mites and putting them into a good home. But we have no reason to believe, on the other hand, that abuse is less frequent in adoption than in the non-adopted population. We have to, and I believe this is a commitment I've made and I ask all of you today to make, to dispel the myth that adoptees are not abused. Because setting up that way of thinking and looking at adoptees prevents them from coming forward, from getting help, and from being able to talk about what's happening to them. Certainly the secrecy that has surrounded adoption has kept us all from knowing what happens in adoptive homes. We all need to establish an open forum where this painful issue can be discussed. I do believe, based on my work in adoption, that adoption is more loaded. It has a higher potential to lead to abuse. That's not to say that it occurs, but there are things which happen in adoption which I think injure adoptive parents and adoptees. And it's that vulnerability that we want to talk about today. Adoption, as you well know, is not an ideal. It's real people struggling with very real issues, often alone, without adequate education, support, or information. All Triad members are forever changed by the experience of adoption. And many of Triad members walk around with what I have to call gaping wounds, held together with those little butterfly things that you put on it before you can get the stitches. And that means that those wounds can be reopened at any time. Adoptees and adoptive parents, and I'm not excluding the birth parent, but for a period of time, the adoptee and the adoptive parents are the ones that are living and united together. Adoptees and adoptive parents are two very vulnerable populations, wounded victims, as you will. The next thing I want to say to you is I don't think I've gotten the words right, so bear with me for just a minute. Adoptees, I believe, because of the fact of their adoption, are in a very vulnerable state. The wound of the adoption, whether that separation occurs at birth or later on, whatever the circumstances, I believe that some of the experiences that occur for them are more damaging than they would be for their non-adopted counterparts. Not to say that many adoptees aren't abused, but I believe that the damage that occurs is greater because of the vulnerability, because of what has happened to adoptees. They are more vulnerable, and adoptive parents, because of the injuries they received, may also be more susceptible to the stressors, which then lead to an abusive situation. And adoptees may be more traumatized if we had two people, adopted and non-adopted, similar kinds of abusive situations. I think adoptees may be more traumatized by what occurs to them and have less, what I would call, bounce back resilience because of the adoption issues that they have. And we need to also look at the fact that many adoptive parents may in fact have been able to manage as parents if they had given birth to children. But when we add the adoption issues, they fall into that category of less than adequate parents. So I think this is the background of the material that we need to look at today. I think some of you have heard me and Sharon Kaplan talk a little bit about the 7 core issues in adoption. And this is not a workshop on the 7 core issues, but it is the way that I understand adoption and the way that I look at the issues. So I want to run through those 7 issues with you quickly and look at them strictly from the adoptive parent issue. Now, a good full presentation would include the issues for birth parents, and I'm going to exclude that for now simply for the sake of brevity in trying to get through it. But I think that these 7 core issues are what make adoptees and adoptive parents so very vulnerable. Let me give you the 7 so you can have that. If you're taking notes, you got them in a list right in front of you. I like lists. I'm allow you to know of my compulsive nature. The first issue is loss. The second, rejection. 3 is guilt and shame. 4 is grief. 5, identity. 6, intimacy. And 7, control. For adoptees, the losses that occur in adoption are never-ending. You may think you know what they are, and just as quickly as that happens, you find some more. The bottom line fear, of course, is the ultimate fear of abandonment. The loss of the biological, genetic, cultural history is just overwhelming. And I've talked to a number of adoptees who've told me that the reason that they didn't go public, that they didn't discuss their abuse, that even today it's hard to talk about it, although they're adults, is that fear of abandonment, and of course the second issue, rejection. And I think that's very, very powerful in asking a youngster to tell the family secrets. Adoptive parents come to adoption through loss, whether it be through infertility, the death of a child, whatever the reason. That loss is equated in some way with a loss of immortality. That's what children by birth bring. It's one of their biggest blessings, if you can remember that on the day that they're not too wonderful, huh? Adoptive parents lose that ability to connect, and their bloodlines stop at the adoption. This leads to many issues of fear of loss of the child, a desire then to hold on, to not experience any further losses. And often we hear how adoptive parents are overprotective and over-controlling. Certainly, for many adoptive parents, adoptees struggling to emancipate, to be independent, to function as an individual, recreates those fears of loss and those anxieties. And I think that loss is really a central theme in what goes on in adoptive families that become abusive. The second issue is rejection. And adoptees, for the most part, talk to me about feeling rejected. I cried too much. That's why my birth mother placed me for adoption. A little boy told me that. So that what happened to him, he believed, was a direct result of who he was. That child then moved into adoption and had to test to see if that was true. And he was a little hell on wheels kid, just waiting for that rejection, trying to set the adoptive parents up for that. So adoptees personalize their placement for adoption as rejection. And that, of course, leads to issues of self-esteem. For adoptive parents, their difficulties with procreation are often experienced as rejection. Rejection by God, by their partner, and they anticipate, because they're parenting someone else's child, that in fact that child may be going to reject them. And I see them reading into a lot of the adoptee's behaviors rejection. He doesn't really like me. He wishes he was with his birth mother, those kinds of feelings. And even if you just picture what that would be like to live with a child where you're experiencing that, you're projecting that onto the child on a daily basis, you sure would be angry and hurt, and perhaps then feel more inclined to be abusive. The third issue that I mentioned is guilt and shame. Adoptees often feel very guilty if they've personalized the adoption experience. Then they look at it as that they did something, and they're guilty for it. And even more core and basic is that feeling of shame. Something about me is intrinsically wrong, and I am not worthy of being loved. I don't deserve love. And I think this leads often to a stance which I see fairly common in adoptees, and that is kind of an angry, defensive stance. I didn't do it. Keep away from my core pain. Birth parents experience a great deal of guilt and shame around their infertility, believing perhaps that they're bad people and that's why they are unable to have children, something they did. I used an IUD too long. I smoked marijuana in college. I've heard a myriad list of folks trying to gain some control over why this happened, but again, personalizing it and believing it has something to do with them. I believe also that adoptive parents who are pretty much in touch with what's going on often feel a great deal of guilt about raising someone else's child. To become an adoptive parent means that somewhere there is a birth parent or birth parents who lost that child, and you can imagine are suffering because of that. And that leads to feelings of guilt and some shame about it. Again, I think setting up a kind of a atmosphere that may become abusive. The next issue is grief. And if you're following me along with all of this, if you have a loss, it has to be grieved. Whatever the size of the loss, there's a process of grief which follows. And Sharon Kaplan and I, when we talk about this, go through with folks the work of Kubler-Ross. And if you're not familiar with that, I think it's real helpful in understanding the grief process in adoption. I see a great many adoptees as very sad, as depressed, as grieving throughout a good part of their life for the losses that they experienced in adoption. I think when adoptees are youngsters, that's often overlooked. We don't like to think of children as unhappy or sad. And so we do a lot of things to deny that pain. But I think that adoptees are quite sad. Often that's blocked until they move into adulthood. And youngsters, when they're depressed, don't do what we adults do of sit around and kind of veg out and become couch potatoes. They often are very hyper, and they do things like setting fires, and they're defiant, and a whole set of behaviors that we see fairly common in adoptees. But again, think of yourself as a parent with all the issues we already outlined, and then you have this kid who's acting out and setting fires and stealing, and it's because you're not a good parent and you're not taking enough control, and see what the mindset can begin to happen in the interaction then that we're having between the adoptee issue and the adoptive parents issue. Adoptive parents have to grieve, and society doesn't set that up. Adopt and you'll get pregnant. All children are the same. That's one of my absolute favorites. If you can't give birth to a child, Ken Watson was talking yesterday about slots. We'll pop another kid into that slot and don't have feelings about it. And I have worked with families recently where they have experienced a miscarriage and the obstetrician has said, well, it's okay because I'm working with a 16-year-old. And within a very short amount of time, that 16-year-old's baby is moved into this adoptive parent's home. No grief, no working through, no understanding that adoptive parenting is not parenting by birth. And I think we have some real issues there. And one of the issues that comes up with unresolved grief is problems in bonding and attachment. And when we look at abuse, we have to look at the quality of the bond, quality of the attachment between parent and child. All the material that I've read on the subject talks about how that's probably the most protective device, if you will, for children. That bond that doesn't make quite a lot of sense, but it just kind of comes from somewhere inside. When people are grieving, when they're depressed, when they're afraid of being rejected, that bond, it can be quite defective. And I think we really need to be doing some risk assessment and looking at adoptive families for that quality. The next issue has to do with identity, and that's one that we talk a lot about for adoptees. You know, who am I? What happened? Those deficits that adoptees have in information, in a sense of rootedness, may block or at least impede the adoptee's development of a sense of who they are, and may lead to things, my hypothesis again, to things like early pregnancies, to acting out, experimenting, more extreme experimenting kinds of behavior, again to develop a sense of belonging and feeling part of, which I think adoptees lack in many ways. Adoptive parents' identity is diminished, their sense of wholeness, that continuity that we talked about, is diminished by the fact of the adoption. David Kirk, years ago, talked about the fact that adoptive parents are parents and they are not parents. And that's called a mishmash identity. And so I believe that adoptive parents sometimes act and react in ways to demand recognition as parents. You know, I'm your real parent, and then the kid says, but I hate you and you're not my real parent, and some real abusive kinds of behaviors can come out of that problem. The lack of information that adoptive parents have about their youngster, about the adoptee, may also lead adoptive parents to be very anxious when children are having problems about, did I cause this? Is it that bad seed stuff? Is it something, are they turning out to be like their birth parents? I mean, adoptive parents have tremendous anxiety. They know very little about the birth parents. But to make adoption okay, they have to make the birth parents not okay. So the birth parents are not okay, then this kid is acting up. Must be that they're turning out like those no good birth parents. So then why did I take this kid? Because I'm not doing any good, and they would have been just the same off with the birth parents. Get the cyclical kind of mentality that can occur when these issues are not resolved. The next to last issue is the one of intimacy. By that we mean relationships. Relationships are tremendously affected by adoption. We have loss. We have issues of rejection, guilt, grief. These are not issues that lead to good, healthy, emotional relationships. I think adoptees often are very afraid of getting too close, or what I see also is like an over-closeness, a clinginess, a pseudo-closeness, if you will, hanging on real tight, kind of afraid to be out in the world, afraid of reenacting those earlier losses, afraid if they say something about the quality of what's going on in the home or the abuse or whatever, like we talked about, they could in fact be booted right on out and be out there again. Claudia Jewett talks something that just is helpful for me because I like things basic and simple, and she said, the worst thing that can happen to a child is to lose their grown-ups. And I think that's real poignant. That is what has happened, and youngsters engage in all kinds of behaviors not to lose their grown-ups again. Because abandonment on the bottom line for a child would equal death. And that's the fear that moves along. So I see that a lot of the bonding issues and so forth lead adoptees to have difficulty in intimate relationships. For adoptive parents, the unresolved grief over their losses may lead to intimacy and marital problems. And we know that marital problems are often a contributor to abusive situations. Now we do know statistically, we're beginning to look at the fact that the divorce rate is higher among adoptive parents than their counterparts who don't adopt. And I think that we're talking and looking at some of the reasons for that. Adoptive parents may also avoid closeness to avoid the possibility of future loss. And that fear of intimacy may also have a lot of issues then around feelings of inadequacy, of not being a good enough parent. I think bottom line in our psychology, a good enough parent gives birth. and anything else is less than good enough. And certainly in the day-to-day parenting, no one feels adequate. So those issues are triggered up again. The last issue, which is my personal favorite because it's the one I struggle with on a daily basis, has to do with control. To be involved in adoption is to be out of control. I think you all know that. That's why we like to get together and feel in control, at least in these rooms. Adoption for adoptees alters their entire life course. What started out in this direction takes a sharp left or a sharp right. And adoptees, we mentioned in the general session yesterday, have no part in how that happens. It just happened. It happened maybe before their consciousness or even as part of their consciousness. I know an older adoptee who was of age where he had a sign at the time of the adoption, and the judge asked him, did he want to be adopted? Now, how many families were standing in that room looking for that kid? And he said, I guess so. What other choice do I have? So even when we make the illusion of choice, there is no choice involved. And adoption for adoptees and adoptive parents is what Seligman has termed a learned helplessness. You do things, but you don't know which things have an outcome, and so you're not at all. So in the home, I experience many adoptive parents struggling to gain some control, and gain that control often over the adoptee. Okay. In terms of the 7 core issues, that's probably the fastest that I've ever gone through them, and I hope that kind of gives you a backdrop for what we're talking about. With that as a backdrop, let's talk a little bit about, what would you call it, plain abuse, not necessarily in an adoptive family, but the more generic information about abuse. Deciding to begin the journey of recovery from abuse is very difficult. For any of you who are here thinking that possibly this is your experience in adoption, it's going to take a lot of courage to go back, to re-experience those feelings and memories, and to what I call get current, to be able to leave that in the past. Why should a person who has experienced abuse need to be able to ready to risk all these things? Again, I hear a lot of time when I work with people who are abused, let them apologize. Why should I have to pay for therapy for what they did to me? Why should I have to be in this pain for what they did to me? Those are reasonable questions. But if people sit around and wait for somebody else to make a change, you've put your whole life on hold. I want to be blunt. Life is not fair. And you can't change what has been done, and you can't change other people. You can, however, get on with your own healing rather than continuing to hurt, waiting for somebody else to do something they're probably not going to do. Many people have a vague sense, and I think this is particularly true for adoptees, of having been abused as a child. But either they lack the memories of the abuse or they've been pushed way far in the back. I hope you don't mind, Elizabeth Ann, but when I went to see her artwork, and I really encourage all of you to go see that art exhibit, she showed me work that she did 6 years ago, which has sort of vague hints in it of what was going on for her. And now, 6 years later, looking at it, she can say, I can't believe that I could draw those things and not see it. And I thought that was just a real poignant example of what we're talking about. I'm going to give you some symptoms that folks often have if they've been abused, kind of as a checking in for you. Let me, like any checklist, you have a couple of them. That doesn't mean that you were abused and you need to go immediately from here to the therapist's office, okay? But if you find a cluster of these symptoms and they've been plaguing you for a little while, then you might want to consider this as a possibility. Things like self-destructive behaviors, compulsions, overeating, alcohol and drug abuse, overly active sexual behaviors. If you were a runaway during childhood and adolescence, we see a lot of those kids actually are trying to get away from the abuse. Learning problems in school or difficulty concentrating that weren't related to a specific learning disability, extreme irritability, suicidal thoughts, gestures, attempts, fear of being alone, or a feeling of being very vulnerable. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a second. When you go through this list, I think many adoptees who were not abused have these feelings. And that's why I say I think it's so hard to separate out the adoption issues and the abuse that's caused by adoption versus concrete specific abuse that occurs in adoptive families as well. The next one would be helplessness, frequent feelings of confusion, chronic sense of anxiety or panic, low self-esteem, choosing relationships in which you are used or taken advantage of, fear of intimacy or close relationships, certainly a lack of trust, or what I talked about, that pseudo-trust, too much trust. You're just trusting of everybody. If you feel that you yourself could be abusive, you have an abusive amount of rage and anger towards other people. And then there's a whole list of bodily symptoms, which in fact often are body memories. The body stores memories of the abuse without you having conscious awareness of them. Feelings like that you're choking, certain parts of your body that hurt a lot. And last one would be any kind of violent recurring nightmares or flashbacks, just kind of pictures. People often have some pictures that come to them and they don't know how they connect or what they are. Those kinds of things are often indicators that people have been abused. And like I say, if there's a cluster of those and they last over time, they are probably worthy of some exploration. When the panel and I talked about putting the workshop together, we wanted to be real careful not to get too gory and graphic. That's hard. And I think that can sidetrack us from the larger issues. But I think that when people are struggling with whether or not they were abused, we need to talk a little bit about what kinds of things are abusive. And I've divided the categories of abuse, if you will, into 5 general categories. Physical, violent abuse, which implies physical harmful action directed at a child with inflicted injuries. Things like burns and bruises, fractures. Second would be sexual. And that would have to do with exploitation, and these are really important words, of a dependent, immature child or adolescent, unable to give consent. Involves things like incest, molestation, and rape. And would go on a continuum from things like nudity, disrobing, fondling, masturbation, all the way through to intercourse. The third, is emotional abuse. And that would be where a child would be terrorized, berated, shamed, or rejected. So it can be actions, or language and words. The fourth one is ritual abuse. And this is a form of abuse that we're just beginning to talk about now. If you're following the Orange County happenings, we happen, in fact, to have a case in court right now of 2 sisters who are suing their mother for a childhood of ritual satanic abuse. Ritual abuse involves all 3 of the above that I was just talking about. The abuse occurs in a ritualized, systematic manner, often involving more than one person, often intergenerational, can be cult-related, can be like a satanic cult or some of the other cults that are around, but is not just satanic, and I think that's a level of confusion. It involves torture, bizarre, and sadistic repeated abuse. And the last one, which I think is actually the most common, is neglect. And lots of times people say, well, which one of these is the worst? You know, let's rate them. And they often would put neglect at the bottom, believing if people left you alone that was better. And that is not at all the case. It's insidious. There aren't any injuries. It's hard for youngsters. Youngsters don't know that this is what's happening to them, and they don't go to school with bruises that a teacher might pick up. So therefore, it can persist for even longer periods of time. It implies the failure of a parent to act to safeguard the health, safety, and well-being of a child. Things like nutritional neglect, the failure to provide medical care, the failure to protect the child. I'm working with a youngster now whose mother was a drug addict and, excuse me, was passed out on the sofa a great deal of the time. And at 7, she not only was cooking for herself, she was taking care of 2 younger siblings. But didn't come to the attention of anybody because there wasn't that kind of outside evidence of what was going on. I rewrote the talk so many times the pages are not always in order. Okay. Well, what exactly, how exactly do we take those adoption issues that we talked about and this abuse, and how does that happen? How do we get into a situation that may be abusive? I think it's very important to recognize that abuse, we're not talking about a single occurrence. Most parents who are honest will tell you they've lost it at least once in parenting, where they've yelled too much, spanked too hard, said things that were painful. It's a fact of parenting. We're not talking about that. Although that's very painful, I don't believe that in the long term that's really what we're talking about in terms of abuse. We're talking about something that occurs on a continuum. It starts, a lot of people say, they say at the time of birth, so I will say at the time of placement, and has something to do. Each child that comes into a family has a certain meaning for that family. And so the way that child fits in, the way the bond occurs, we can sometimes go back and look at the fact that that was like a setup, and we'll say, that family was really set up, or that child was set up, and we can go back and, looking back. Let's remember that historically, society has not been very worried about the maltreatment of children. It's only in the last 25 years or so that there's been much attention to the issue of child abuse at all. What I found in my little discussions and research about adoption was that a lot of people question whether looking at abuse and adoption is an issue at all, because adoptees are throwaway kids anyway. They got better than they would have had. And there's always the question about whether adoption is for adoptees or for adoptive parents, an issue that I think we've begun to talk about again at this conference. We need to keep talking about it because people are often, I believe, children are placed with adoptive parents who are not ready, who are not able, who are not educated, because we think that they should be parents. And the pain of their not being parents is just too great for the professionals involved to stand. And so they get a child when, in fact, a lot of people know that that is not going to be a good place. We kind of, I see these cases still regularly. I work a lot with older children being placed. Well, they're not a great family, but, maybe we can't, and they just kind of an acceptance that that's okay. And I recently have had a youngster who was placed at 3, and there was a report, and the mother was kind of maybe abusive, and I said, this is a bad situation, but by the time they started looking at it, it was a year and a half later, and he's been there a long time, and needless to say, about 3 weeks ago, he had to be removed. And I think that there's something of an acceptance and the system kind of just going along with, and I think that this is really very difficult. Okay, so what are the things that traditionally would contribute to abuse? Let me dispel a couple more myths, because I sent out a questionnaire, and I have more copies here for you. Any of you who are adoptees or involved in adoptee search and support groups, any way that you could get these out. I'm really interested in getting more information back, so I have them up here, and I urge you to take them. In the surveys that I got back, I got a lot of messages about adoptive parents, that folks who were responding wanted me to do something about those adoptive parents so that they couldn't get kids. I want to tell you that, at least until today, there is no litmus test, there is no psychological test to determine absolutely that someone is going to be abusive, yes or no. We professionals can conjecture, We can give a whole lot of information and ideas, and there is some body of agreed upon knowledge. But we're never going to be able to say absolutely 100% that a family, adopted or not, are not going to abuse a child. And I think it's an unrealistic hope and expectation that a lot of folks conveyed to me on these surveys, that somehow by beginning to talk about it, we'd be able to fix it. Because abusive parents, for the most part, don't look different. I mean, if you were sitting next to somebody who abused their child last night, you wouldn't know. And that's the reality. They're not usually psychotic. They're not abnormal, for the most part. And they're not criminals. And I think we need to begin to look at that. It's very difficult to screen adoptive parents with the potential for abuse out. And we want all of us to say, they are that way. I mean, it would be nice. We'd all feel better today if I could say to you, adoptive parents who abuse their children are this, and this is the profile. What I'm going to say to you is that for the most part, they are like you and me. And we don't like that, because then there's a potential in there that we could. I think on the flip side, it's very important to say somewhere in our heart, we could, because then we can have some empathy and some understanding and get in there and be really helpful. When you say that somebody's not like me at all, it puts them very far, and there may or may not even be a bridge that you could cross over and get there. With that warning, let me just go through a couple of the things that we do know, that we see in families where abuse occurs. The first one, and one of the most important factors, is isolation. Where there isn't a give and take, where there aren't people in and out of the house, where there isn't information in and out, these families are very isolated with rigid boundaries. And there's also a belief in the family that needs have to be met within the family. For example, in families where sexual abuse occurs, perpetrators, I've had them say it to me, well, isn't it better than going to a prostitute? That sexual needs should be met within the family, because we're family. And the outside world is bad, but the family is a place to get all your needs met. For the most part, these are generalities, and I hesitated about giving a checklist because I feel like somebody's going to run around and hold it up to the prospective adoptive families and say, well, you're on this checklist and therefore you're out, and that's dangerous. But for the most part, families have issues with self-esteem. I hope as I'm going through this, you're thinking about the adoption issues that I talked with you about, because that's where they come together so much. There often are marital problems, feelings of inadequacy. This is clicking in, unresolved grief. I'm taking this from the literature on abuse, not adoption, but here are the connections that occur. Sometimes it has to do with the characteristics of the child. A child who's ill, behavior problems with children, a lot to do with parents' expectations of the child. Parents' expectations, thinking that a child who's going to fix something, maybe like infertility, is going to do certain things to become like them in some way. A lack of bond, that issue with fit, whether someone fits in the family and feels like the family. One of the surveys I got back, I believe it was a woman, said to me that she'd been abused by an uncle who told her, sexually abused, tell her it was fine because she wasn't part of the family. So it really wasn't incest. A lot of issues come up with that fit, and are you part of the family or are you somebody outside? Substance abuse, and interestingly, I did not get enough surveys back to say that this is anything but people writing to me. But 201 in the surveys I got back, there was information about substance abuse. And that's consistent with what we know, that a lot of the families where abuse occurs, there is a history of substance abuse, alcohol, drugs particularly. One of the most consistent features that we see in families where abuse occurs is a history of abuse in the parent's background.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
Rule out anybody who's been abused. The probability of things going okay is higher when, in fact, there's been some treatment. And I've been referred a few families where there was a history of abuse who wanted to adopt, and we had to look at those issues and how those things could set themselves up. Well, if abuse has occurred, then what? What happens for people who've been abused? And I'm going to rely on our panel in a lot of ways to talk about that. But when I have someone come into my office who's been abused, adopted or not, I kind of see a similar kind of pattern. And we touched on it. The first thing that gets them through childhood is denial. And let's not put it down, denial. It can be very helpful. We talked about that vague feeling that something happened but not really knowing, or losing memories altogether. The lack of trust, many unmet needs, a real feeling of neediness. The lack of attachment or intimacy issues, sometimes confusion about sexuality. Sometimes people come into treatment because they find themselves in a pattern of abusive relationships, either physically abusive, sexually, or emotionally. They're often very angry, depressed, suicidal, and withdrawn. Mention self-destructive behaviors, whether that is for them substance abuse or eating disorders, self-mutilation, difficulties in being autonomous and emancipating, and a lot of times physical problems, often with no organic cause. Doctors will say, I don't know why you don't feel well, but I can't find anything. I want to switch hats because we've been looking at adoptive parents and adoptees and talking about what's happened for them. But what about birth parents? Birth parents, today and in the past, are told either directly or indirectly that adoption is going to be very good for their child. It's going to work out. It's going to be the best thing you could do for your child. And the one that's kind of hard for me right now that's going around is what a gift you're giving to the adoptive parents. That's the myth, that it's going to be really, really good. And a birth mother recently told me that that myth was what got them through their child's growing up. That getting up each day and believing that their child was doing well, was in a loving home, was what could get them from the morning to the night with their pain. What we're going to be looking at this morning is then what happens when there is a reunion, and that myth was a total lie. And we have two birth parents here who can talk about that much more eloquently than I can. I'm just going to highlight then what may be some of the issues for birth parents when there is a reunion, and at the end of the reunion they find that their youngster, that their adoptee was abused. Guilt. I should have never placed them. Guilt. I should have searched when they were a minor. I thought about it, and somebody talked me out of it. Maybe I could have saved them. Maybe I could have protected them. Maybe I could have stopped it. Those kinds of things. Anger. Anger at the system. I was ripped off. I was lied to. Anger at themselves for doing this. Certainly rage and anger at the adoptive parents. May in fact generalize to adoptive parents in general. A sense of betrayal. All the people who pushed me towards adoption betrayed me. The system betrayed me. Those adoptive parents betrayed me. Certainly disappointment. A lot of denial. Birth parents begin to get a hint of that in the relationship and pull back that fear. A reliving of the decisions that led to the adoption, kind of a flashing, if you will, of all of that, and how did I come to that, and how did I do that. Perhaps an avoidance of the adoptee. If I don't have contact, if I don't write letters, then maybe I won't have to have these feelings and I won't have to think about what happened. On the other hand, perhaps a desire to parent that adoptee, although the adoptee may be 24 or 34 years old, but I could fix it by being a good parent now. Again, low self-esteem, the idea going, I make bad decisions. I do bad things. I do things that lead to other people being hurt. I'm not saying this is rational thinking, but I think these are some of the issues that come up. And certainly a reawakening of all the grief and agony that the birth parent went through at the time of placement, and an active grieving process that starts up again. Well, now that you've gotten so depressed, you're going to ask me straight out, can we predict or prevent abuse in adoption? I mean, that would be the bottom line, right? If we're going to go through all of this, can we at least do something about it? I've already kind of given you a hint that my belief is that we can't, but there are things that we can do. We can begin by seeing adoptive parents who abuse children not as monsters, not as those others that I talked about, but rather people who are anxious, injured, unhappy people who entered into adoption for the right reasons, and something went wrong. And we can certainly say that they're responsible for their behavior, but I also think we need to look at the institution of adoption and how that has set some of that up for them. We must open up the adoption system. Closed systems participate and contribute to this. We must do research. We have to get statistics. Been trying to get the folks in Orange County, when they take an abuse report at the Child Abuse Registry, to find out if the child was adopted. To find out if, but we don't want to upset them. We don't want to invade the privacy. There's a whole set of reasons that come along. We need to educate adoptive parents and professionals better about abuse, about adoption, so that the professionals can pass this information on and can create systems which serve all triad members. We need to look at these bonding and attachment issues and recognize early the warning signals that something's not going well in an adoptive family. We need to recognize that not everyone can be a good adoptive parent. Some could parent by birth and not by adoption. And it's important, I believe, that it is not a right to be a parent. We are not given. That is not a right. It is a privilege. And we need then to be looking at the focus on children, not on the fact that everybody can be a parent. And we need to provide post-adoption services that include treatment for families with the potential to become abusive. What I want to talk to you about is just a little bit about the survey that I mentioned that I sent out to you that's up here. I want to tell you just some interesting anecdotal things from the surveys. And then I want to end with a little story I have for you. The survey indicates that adoptees were adopted at a variety of ages, that being adopted as an infant or as an older child doesn't seem to connect with whether or not abuse occurred. There doesn't seem to be a real difference between agency and private adoptions. There was a wide range of forms that the abuse took and a variety of perpetrators. None of this is particularly surprising because this is what happens in the non-adopted world. But if you were thinking that there was something just special about, adoptive families, I'm here to say I don't think so. It was unclear, and I need to work a little bit more and get some more information, whether adoptees were abused more than their non-adopted siblings. And it's something that interests me very much, and what goes on. As I mentioned before, it frequently seems related to substance abuse. And I had listed on my survey factors that I thought might be contributing to the abuse. And folks agreed with me, which was very nice. They talked about a lack of bonding, the adoptees' special needs, unrealistic expectations, the mix between birth and adopted children, environmental stressors, which we kind of know, unemployment, money, those kind of things, adoptees' behavior problems, parents' mental illness. I got stars, checks, and yes, yes, yes to unresolved infertility. Adoptees saw that as a big, important part of the whole issue. One adoptee scribbled a little note on the bottom of her survey that really touched me, and I want to share that with you. She said, "I don't feel like most people care if adoptees are abused because they act like we were lucky to have been raised by anyone, even if those people were monsters to us." And I think that that really does sum up society's attitude in many ways to what goes on. Let me tell you about the queen in her closets. Once upon a time, there was a special queen who ruled her kingdom with love and nurturing. She had many children, and she spent much of her time living in the castle, raising the children and loving the subjects and being the very best queen she knew how to be. She spent so much time taking care of everyone around her that she really didn't have time to clean her closets. So over the years, she accumulated more and more things until the closets were more and more filled. Finally, the queen decided that it was time to get rid of all the things that she had accumulated through the years and that had stuffed into her closet. So early one morning, she began to clean, pulling everything from one or two closets and throwing these things in the center of the room. She cleans like I do. Surveying the huge pile of mess that she'd made on the floor, she felt tired and overwhelmed, and she wondered if she'd make a mistake by deciding to clean her closets. The queen was so exhausted and overwhelmed by that mess that she left the castle and she went downtown to take her mind off what she was doing. She decided to sit on a bench in the park. But as she sat, the queen noticed an old peasant woman who lived in the park. She slept in the park and she carried all her possessions around with her everywhere she went. The queen found herself fascinated with this peasant woman and began to watch her carefully. The queen watched as the peasant woman pulled the things out of her bag and then stuffed them all back in. And the queen began to understand that the old woman carried too many things around with her in her bag, making the bag too heavy and burdensome. The items that she carried included things that were useful and useless, and some that were just a heavy burden. Suddenly, a new understanding began to flow through the queen. She began to see herself in a new and different way, and that understanding enabled her to return to the castle. She entered the room where she'd been cleaning the closet. She noticed that the room looked very different. And because she had come to see the room in a different way, she understood the items she needed to throw away, the items she needed to rearrange and replace in the closet, and the items she must give away to someone who could use them more than she. And because of this new understanding, the queen's closets were soon neat and orderly, giving her freedom to find new direction and a new meaning in her life. What I'd like to do now is to turn our discussion over to our panel members. They want to tell you a little bit about their stories, and they're going to work real hard to be talking specifically about the abuse that is part of their story and how that links up with adoption. And then we will have time for discussion. So I'm hoping that you're thinking about the things that you want to share and the questions that you might want to be asking. We're going to start over here with Elizabeth Ann, and I'm going to let her do her own introduction.
There's a lot of stuff up here. Actually, I don't usually go by writing things down, but there's so many things to say. So I have jotted 2 pages of notes just as I've been sitting here. I'm an adoptee, and my birth mother's on the panel, and I'm here to speak and elaborate on a lot of things that Deborah has been working on. The interesting thing is that I never would have thought that I would be standing here speaking about this or in any way identifying with being abused in adoption, because I was in real denial over this myself and thought everything was kind of fine and that's the way life was. I'm going to try and go through a couple things here. I feel with what Deborah was saying with the artwork too, I was in touch with a lot of things that was going on throughout my childhood and adolescence, and yet not really allowing that to kind of get into my life and my actions and what I was about, because I guess I really didn't have the capacity to be able to deal with it until I found my birth parents and birth family, sisters and brothers, and became in an area of safety and with much unconditional love, and able to, I guess, begin looking back and having a lot of memories and feelings and pain over what I went through that I didn't know I'd gone through. In brief, to fill you in maybe on a bit of what I went through, I had a lot of problems with my adoptive mother. My adoptive father is an alcoholic, and I'm not really sure where he was when these things went on. My adoptive mother was very verbally and mentally and some physical type of abuse towards me. I have two adoptive brothers as well, which possibly because they became quite involved with drugs and alcohol, they kind of, I think, escaped from certain types of abuse that I became subject to because I took the good adoptee that's hold the family together, and this is what I'm there for, and I'm supposed to be grateful, and I became a pillar that took what was fed out from this woman towards me. And it was really tough. It's hard to speak about. I haven't actually ever spoken about this before, and I've done a lot of speaking, and it's hard for me to identify myself still to my abuse, and I guess it's hard for me to be a part of that, and yet that's a part of me, and I have to acknowledge that inside myself as well. My adoptive mother, I believe, actually I should say my adoptive mother and my adoptive father have many issues that were not dealt with prior to my adoption. And as you had mentioned with this survey, I'm sure I was one of these people that starred 45 times across their not having dealt with their infertility issues. I need some water. Thanks. And I feel that this is something we all need to really look at. And it's funny that I can even say this because I haven't had a child. I'm not an adoptive parent. But I really feel I identify through my experience as an adoptee and through trying desperately to understand why they did this to me. Not just them, but the system. Why was I born and cast off into a situation that the adoption agency already knew that was going to happen to me. They had evaluated these people and said they were unfit to have a child, and then the next day placed me with this family. And I've tried to understand why does this type of abuse happen? Why do I hear this through so many other adoptees? I lead a group, I do a lot of listening, a lot of reading, and this is not uncommon. This type of abuse that happens in adoption is very similar throughout many situations, and it does hit differently than in non-adoptive families. There is a difference. I believe that the issues with infertility, getting back to my first thread there, and not being acknowledged prior to these adoptive parents, my parents, accepting a child and taking a child, resulted in the abuse that I went through. I think that their issues of loss from my adoptive father not being able to have his lineage, his name really carried on. I mean, I can pretend, but I'm not really doing it. His longing for a son to perhaps carry on the business and having instead two adoptive sons that are not straight A students, don't have any interest in law, and are off flying planes and making plastic bags. It's hard to connect. It's hard to give them what they want. And as a result, their frustration came out in abuse and in alcohol. So I feel they were very unfulfilled, and I tried to fulfill what I was supposed to do and couldn't either. And I think that the feelings of their inadequacy as well, especially for my adoptive mother, her inadequacy in terms of not really being a full woman, not being able to produce a child, which I'm sure we all dream of doing as women. That's part of our lives. Part of being a woman is to bear and carry to term a child and have your own biological child. And I think that her issues were not dealt with, and I became, as I grew and became a woman, a real source of just sheer pain for her to look at, because it brought up the issues she hadn't dealt with and therefore brought out the abuse. Neither of them, I think, had an opportunity to grieve over the loss of having not had their own biological children. And the loss over that, again, perpetrated the abuse. And in speaking of the abuse, maybe to fill you in a little more on that, I think that a lot of the verbal abuse told me these things, in being told, oh, your father never can accept the fact you were adopted, or overhearing arguments, John should have been put in with a family of farmers, or, here, you really tune in when you're a kid, you're not dumb. You don't have to be told things, you can sense, what's going on. My adoptive mother was feeling she was very inadequate, couldn't mother, a terrible mother, we're a terrible family. And so I became terrible. I was very selfish. I became, I think, the pit of her loss. And her anger she had towards not having had children, her pain of their situation was directed out towards me because it wasn't worked with. I feel for her. I feel for both of them because they weren't allowed and given the space and the time and the attention prior to adopting, to grieve, to get over some of these issues. And I think that's really important now. I think it's really, really important that we help adoptive parents, and we don't help them, we are not helping them by saying, whoa, here's a baby for you. You can't have one? Great, here's your solution. Because adoption is not the solution. And we need to do a lot of work after people have gone through all these tests and all this horrible stuff that happens before we decide, okay, we'll place a child with you. That didn't happen in my case. And so I feel that needs to be addressed, definitely. There's just so much to speak about, and I know we just had 10 minutes, and I feel probably everyone will then speak on different things that I've written down anyway. This is a tiny bit, and maybe I'll turn this over to my birth mom, Sarah, and let you continue on as I began to realize what had happened and share with my mom everything, how she was affected by this. Thanks. I hope I made some sense. Thank you.
I'm Sarah, and I'm Elizabeth Ann's birth mother, and I am so proud of her. She's wonderful. I wrote down a question that I thought was relevant to this. I never did see the questionnaire, but how do you feel after you've been reunited with your daughter and you find out that she has been abused in the family that you were told was so wonderful and could provide so much more than I ever could? And in fact, it was my decision to put her up for adoption because I believed I could not handle the situation alone, and at that time there was nothing out there for single mothers, and you were, maybe one step up from a whore. So I wrote down a few things. The initial reaction was shock to that this ideal situation was not what I had believed all those years my daughter was living in. And I felt guilty that this had happened to her because I thought, oh God, it's my fault because I gave her away. And anger, I was so angry at the agency because we later found out that it was a very sloppy adoption. They didn't even make a home visit on this couple. And they came in one day and a report was written up that they weren't yet ready for adoption. They hadn't dealt with many issues. And the next day they rang them up and offered them my baby. So my anger at the agency, right away I wrote a letter and I wanted to sue them. But, that takes money. And I also wanted to get through some things. We are still trying to get my daughter's birth certificate that is supposed to have my name as her mother on it. And so far, all we've got is a piece of paper with her name on. And you try to get her birth certificate, which is basically her right, and every other American or Canadian or whatever you are can get your birth certificate. However, we got a letter back saying that from day 1 to 6, she did not exist. And those are the words. Unfortunately, we don't have the letter with us, but those are the words. From day 1 to 6, she did not exist, and she only existed when she got the place in this family. I have felt terribly sad for her in that every child only has one childhood, and it should be happy, free. I mean, the only time in your life that you can really be a free being, because you don't have all these things hanging around you about how to make money and pay rent and telephone. That's another story. That's one of our therapy, is to phone each other, well, 3 times a day. And I live in New York, so if you want to recover fast, you get your first phone bill. And I have also felt terribly insulted by this family that they could have done this to this beautiful gift I gave them. They insulted her and me and the trust that was given to them, and betrayed. And I have to get over this feeling about them, because I realize that this is really a sick woman. And she was never, I think people around her just covered it up, and they didn't realize, they didn't want to face it, and they didn't get this poor woman help. However, my daughter suffered as a result of this. And I felt despair, another feeling that came out. And of course, you do feel, at the time, I felt very unworthy of being able to do anything for my daughter. And obviously, this family that I was told was so ideal and so competent and so professional, and financially, she was going to have a wonderful life. And financially, she did. There's no doubt about that. And she had a wonderful education and was able to pursue her art. And, I'm thankful that she was able to do all that, and I very likely would not have been able to provide all that for her if I had continued in the vein I did, because I did this alone. My family did not know about Elizabeth Ann, because I felt at that time, the usual thing, I would have been thrown out, and undoubtedly in those days I would have been. You have to get beyond this. I mean, it has been a big black cloud over everything, and I want to get out of that. And it's very easy to get bogged down with all this, and you just got to sort of say, well, put it back where it belongs, in the past. And it's very easy to talk about doing this. Forget about it. Well, you're never going to forget about it. We're going to live with it and accept it and move on, because we have each other now, and nobody is going to take that away from us again, ever. And we're now going from today and tomorrow and many, many, many tomorrows. Elizabeth Ann is now my daughter. Well, she always has been in my heart, but now physically I have her back, and I thank God for that. And I think I should move on. I'm sure I've...
I don't quite know where to start, because I'm not used to being in this position either, of speaking formally and being taped. And I have a lot of fears. Deborah's description about what abused people feel was striking just about every familiar chord in my body, so I'm really kind of shaky. So if you'll bear with my shaky voice, I'll try to get through this. Denial was my drug of choice, as was my family's drug of choice, and my parents chose to deny the fact that this was all happening, really. They looked at it as an ugly mistake that they wanted to erase. And my circumstances were complicated by the fact that I was raped, acquaintance rape they call it today, and the perpetrator was a black acquaintance of mine, which made it even worse in 1963. And this was in Pennsylvania. My parents took me to the police department, and they said, well, you can't prove rape, and you probably asked for it. So my parents always liked to put on the perfect appearance. You know, we were a perfect family from everybody else's perspective. So they denied what was happening, and we went through. Abortion was never an option for us. My father was a minister. And so the pregnancy was pursued. I finished my junior year in high school. We moved from one city to another, and I was placed in a maternity home where it was merely custodial until, you know, we could be rid of this burden. And the neglect that prevailed at that maternity home was, I'm just now beginning to realize, because I've forgotten or I've repressed a lot of what happened. But in my labor and delivery, for instance, there was no one there except for the mere clinical support and examination. And during the delivery, they kept forcing a mask on me, you know, saying, oh, breathe this, breathe this. And it wasn't a general anesthesia. I remember the last push and feeling, you know, utter relief. Sheer terror the whole time because I had no idea what was going on. No, I didn't know what to expect. And I know I dissociated from the whole experience from a psychological standpoint. I mean, I closed my eyes and I wasn't there. And throughout this process at the maternity home, I had a social worker who was fresh out of college. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. And I have her notes. The adoption agency gave me the notes. And she was pretty insightful. But she also bought the whole package about adoption and bought into my parents' desire to just have a real quick adoption and get this over with. But the fact was, I was told that my daughter would probably never be adopted because of her biracial facts, and that there was only one foster home for her to go to. So I didn't have that sugar-coated myth about the ideal set of parents to even give me the daily cushion to know that, oh, she was being cared for. So I switched into overdrive denial, and that's the way I got through, well, if you can call it getting through, many years of wanting to get her back. I wanted her desperately. I remember the day that we had to go down and sign the final papers. I had a raging argument with my father, begging him to allow me to keep this child. My mother wavered once, and all it took was some comment from my father to get her right back on his side. And in that interview, that last interview with the social worker, she tried to make my desire to mother my child as something sick and pathological, that it was really some sick need that I had from my own ego and my own lack of belonging in my own family. And as an aside, I always felt that I was adopted. And I never felt like I belonged in that family, and I couldn't understand why they would treat me so badly in a family of, you know, my own natural parents. But so the social worker equated this normal maternal instinct as something that was more related to my low self-esteem and my needing of a sense of belonging. And the last sentence in her note was that I would probably become pregnant again out of wedlock in that search. And prophetically that became true, and rather than go through that again, I had an abortion, because at that time abortions were legal. But then I made the determination to search, and I don't have time to go through the steps that led to that decision, but I contacted the agency and found a very sympathetic and compassionate social worker who agreed totally with my right to know my daughter. And she facilitated the whole process, and my first concern was that she was alive. Okay, she was alive. My second concern was she ever adopted? And she said, yes, she was adopted. And, you know, I mean, that was like a tremendous burden lifted from my shoulders. And she was in fact adopted by her foster parents, so she had, I was again relieved that she had this continuity from 5 days of age, throughout the rest of her life. And the greatest delight that I had was that they maintained the name that I gave her, which was a request that I made of my social worker. I said, please don't let them change her name. And her name was retained. So within 10 days of my initial contact of the agency, I was talking to my daughter. It was so easy. And everything was wonderful. There's this whole honeymoon kind of aura that takes place at the time of reunion. And I flew to Philadelphia to meet her 5 days later. And in the short time that we had together, my highs again came crashing down when I learned that she was in a black family. And she said that, she had a wonderful relationship up until the time that she learned that she was adopted. And then everything changed. Her mother became racist. She would say, you don't like us because we're black. You think you're better than we are. Her punishments were to take her to cemeteries after dark and leave her there. And then come back for her and say, now you come back and tell everybody you're ready to be part of the family. And she never knew what she did wrong. She physically abused her on one occasion, and she needed stitches. She hit her on the face. She wouldn't take her for medical treatment and kept her home from school until her wound healed. And she kicked her out of the house at 19. And prior to that, she said, oh, you'll start whoring around when you're 15, and you'll never amount to anything. And she held up another adopted sister as the model, and the one that would be ideal. And as in fact it has reversed. That ideal sister is on welfare with 5 illegitimate children and a drug addict. And her children were responsible for setting the grandmother's house on fire and burning it to the ground last year. So my healing process began with my decision to search, my association with Concerned United Birth Parents and with the American Adoption Congress, and with my faith in prayer and therapy. And I'm back in school trying to find a niche now somewhere in the world where I can make a difference in these issues. But my adoption, my recovery is hampered by the fact that my daughter has no adoption issues. She's in denial. Must be genetic. But I'm going to continue to be available to her and patient. She'll be 20.
This is the end of tape A. Please continue on to tape B. The American Adoption Congress 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 26.
My hope is that she'll come around and that we'll be able to have a relationship like Elizabeth Ann and Sarah. You have a wonderful thing. Thank you.
These guys have green shoes on, both of them. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. How many people here have green shoes on? You do too? Lost siblings.
I was born in Montreal too.
Oh, we'll have to talk after. I'm Danielle. I'm Danielle Marie Baker, because Marie Baker is who I started out to be, and then somehow it all got changed around. So when I found my birth mother 3 years ago, I took the Marie Baker back. So now I'm Danielle Marie Baker. And I always tell them to write that on here, and they don't. I think of all people that should follow that, this should be the place, but they don't. Too many letters. It's funny, I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of this stuff, and I've talked on this issue a lot. I've talked about abuse and molest without adoption as being part of it, and I've talked about the two together, and I've been up for a day and a half. Really, I have not slept since the night before last. Today, I got something I really didn't expect. I came to help. I was asked to do this, and I came to give, and instead I got what Deborah did here today. Made me feel validated in a way I've never felt, and I've been doing this for a long time. I've been dealing with this stuff for a long time, and I've been in therapy forever. That's the only way I can continue to exist. I have never been able to defend myself and to grab people and say, this is what's going on. Because I didn't have the language, I didn't have the wherewithal, I couldn't divorce myself enough so that I could finish school and, get a handle clinically on what was going on with me. And I've always had to look to people outside of me to help me know what's going on inside of me. And talk about vulnerable. That leaves you in a really vulnerable place. I've had some people who really led me astray because of that very thing. And I've had to fight and keep going, and it's been very, very tough. What Deborah did today for me was a great service, so I don't know if she helped anybody else, but she sure helped me a whole lot. And she gave me words that I can use. And those are so important to me. I've spent a lifetime full of emotion, but I didn't have words. And to me, the words are so freeing. I can write them down, and now I can talk to other people about them. Now when I leave here today, I can go home and I can grab all my psychologist friends. I have a whole crew of them. I can grab them all and say, let's talk about guilt and shame, and I've come to understand that guilt, I don't know if this is true, I'm a layman, guilt is when you feel bad about what you've done, and shame is when you feel bad about who you are, and that's certainly the case for me. I'm always the horror story. I'm always the one that the story that you tell yourself can't be true, that you don't want to believe, that you don't want to hear. You don't want to hear. I was abused, I think, in every way that was described here. When Deborah first mentioned ritual abuse, I thought, I don't relate to that. This is great. Somebody's mentioned something I don't relate to, And as she was defining it today, I was thinking, well, do enemas strapped to the kitchen table count as ritual? No, I'm going to put that under physical. And then I thought, well, no, maybe we need to be open to putting that under ritual. I don't know. But anyway, I was seriously abused, and my mother was one of those people that was psychotic. She was diagnosed as being psychotic. My father was an alcoholic. She was an alcoholic. It's a miracle I'm standing here relatively sane. It really is a miracle. I was abused every single day. And I wound up in places where they lock you up because you're too helpless to make your own choices, And somehow, I don't know what happened, but a light went on when I was about 19 years old, and I realized it's going to be like this for a long time, until I die. No one is going to come along and change this. This is all the better it's ever going to get. It's up to me. I kept saying, somebody's got to do something, and I realized I'm somebody, and I'm all I have. So I decided to turn it around. And boy, when these people say it's tough, they are not kidding. It has almost killed me. I can't tell you how many times. And I've been on the verge of suicide and all these things that they talk about, and anorexic and bulimic, and I go this way and then I go that way, and back and forth, and the scars are just from head to toe, and still, as open as I am, it's hard to even say it, still, no one touches me. There are people that think they do, and there are people that come close to it, and there's people that really want to, but they just can't because of me. I'm doing it. I'm keeping them out. And I have that vacillating trust, where I trust everybody and I trust no one except everyone, but not really. I do that. And I'm just the classic. I'm the casebook. Why abuse is such a horrible thing. I used to belong to this church, and they'd say, wives, sisters, daughters, mothers, all that stuff, and I wasn't any of those things. It really hurt. I wasn't any of those things. This was a family-based church, That's why I went there. Like, maybe I can slip in the back and just act like I'm attached to someone, nobody will know the difference. I can just keep moving, from group to group, and they'll never notice, who is this girl? She doesn't belong to anybody, And in that group, it became really clear to me that I didn't fit. In the Sunday school with the children, I felt like they would stand me up and say, live right, or this is what you'll be. I felt like I'd be held up as the example of all the disgusting, filthy things you'd never want to be, It's been really tough, but it's also been really worth it. It's been really, really worth it. The accolades are always nice. And I use every bit that I can get. I speak out to help the guy coming up after me. I don't know if we're born with X amount of strength. I don't know about this stuff because I just barely survive from day to day, and I can only look at it so far. And I can't go back to school. I can't handle it, you know. But I don't know if we're born with X amount of strength, and I have a little bit more than the guy coming up after me. But I'm really concerned about that guy, and I think somebody's got to tell. So I decided a long time ago that my adoptive parents wanted to fire me, and I decided that I'd fire them. So I fired them first. And they've both died, and they deserve it. And it's hard for me to find that compassion in my heart to say they were sick, and you know they did the best they could, and you know that stuff. They did, but it wasn't good enough. It just wasn't good enough. Those people should not have been given a child. And how that slipped through is beyond me. It's really beyond me. My mother was a crazy lady. She tied me up. She strapped me to the kitchen table. She would hide in the dark against the wall and jump out at me and wrestle me to the ground and just say things that I still don't even understand. She talked about spiders. I don't know what she was talking about. I just don't know what she was talking about. My father would look the other way and just get drunk, and then they adopted another one. How these people got 2 children. They had money. You know, I'm sure that had something to do with it. Anyway, I have a whole list of things here. I just concur with what everybody was talking about. When my mother got pregnant, she also was raped. My panel tomorrow will be about that. My birth mother, yeah. Today she's my mother. I found her. She's the only mother I've ever had. I was the problem. I was the bump. You know, a bump came out of this. I was the problem. And somehow they turned it all around so I could become the solution, you know. And I decided I didn't want to be a thing anymore, a commodity. I wanted to be a person. So I have all this stuff here that's really good. How much time do we have left? Probably none, right? A couple minutes. I've walked around in a fugue state. I've been 6 feet underwater my entire life. After Deborah, what she did was so eloquent, I really feel like I just can't add anything to it except to concur that it really is so. But also, I like to offer the hope that even when it's as blatant as my situation, and almost especially when it's as blatant as my situation, because I can divorce myself from it and say, those people were nuts. You know, that's not a part of me. I can be something separate from that. Although it gets all tangled up together, the hope is you can get a lot better. You can get a whole lot better. You can really do almost anything that you want to do. And all it took for me was seeing one movie that one person did it. And I thought, well, most people don't, but one did. One did. And if that one can, then this one can. So I like to say, if this one can, then anybody can.
You've been sitting very quietly and listening, and we'd like to give you the opportunity to give your comments, your questions, your feedback. Esther.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to applaud the panel because I think that they expressed themselves really eloquently and courageously, because I think it's very hard to get up there and kind of bare your soul in the way that you have, and I really appreciate that. From a clinical standpoint, from a treatment standpoint, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all the information that was given today, and I guess I'm wondering a lot of different things in terms of the people who seek treatment. First of all, in terms of the adoptive parents, are you finding that adoptive parents are coming to you basically when their kids are manifesting all of this acting out behavior, and that's how you initially hook them, or are they coming to you because they themselves are feeling these stirrings of problems that they feel need to get resolved? Because it seems like so many adoptive parents don't resolve these infertility issues and end up coming into treatment way too late.
I would agree with that observation. It's not my experience or the people that I have worked with that adoptive parents come in and say, I have unresolved infertility issues and it's making difficulty in my relationship with the adoptee. They bring in a kicking and screaming adoptee who's all bad and they need to get fixed. And it's a very delicate process to weave them into any kind of acknowledgement that they have a part in this at all. And that's real intricate because there's so many issues going on at that point in time that it's very, very hard. And it's very threatening, I think, to adoptive parents to acknowledge that they aren't perfect, wonderful, that whole list, and that they're supposed to be the better parents. I mean, that's really what we set up here. And I think it keeps people from asking for help, and I know that it keeps society from looking and seeing what's actually going on there. Annette?
Yeah, first I'm listening to both Danielle and Elizabeth Ann. It reminds me a bit of a descriptive thing I once read where people were divided into three. There was China, the plastic, and stainless steel. And the China ones were translucent, and if you touched them, they all fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us are kind of plastic, with gouge and scratched, but we remain intact. And then there are those stainless steel ones, and nobody knows why, but no matter how mucky the world they've been in, they sort of get burnished and lovelier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of you young women reflect that in a very special kind of way. Now, whether it's the luck of the genetics or whatever it is, you're there. What I guess I'm wondering on a whole other level is when you divide up the family with a substance abuse, let's say, the mean drunk who take it out on their kids, etc., where the non-adoptive family and the adoptive families kind of merge, and where the borders are blurred because the children aren't really their own, they're adopted, and they can become scapegoats in a very special kind of way. And whether we don't have to kind of take a deeper look at the specific special abuses of adoption, the way they scapegoat them in a way you don't in a regular abuse family.
I think that there are, what do you call it, the basic abusive issues, and then there's the layer that comes because there's opportunities to abuse because of the adoption. Like I said, I think that folks are more vulnerable to that, and I think that we really need to look. We're just in looking at the fact of being different is not okay in our society, and not being like your family. And then there's an abusive quality to that in our society. And I think when you begin to talk about abuse, and that's why we all had a hard time, being very specific, because the layers of abuse in adoption are myriad.
As a social worker who plays kids, I carry great guilt
Mm-hmm.
about a lot of families that I approve.
Mm-hmm.
And most specifically, I remember post-World War II when all the Holocaust survivor families came and applied to adopt. And I had great guilt that I was safe and they had suffered and everything else. And it totally blurred my vision. I approved a lot of families who had such trouble staying afloat themselves. They were so handicapped, so terribly damaged. And I know those children suffered and were abused.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can get into that place. And there's power in politics and agencies. And when Elizabeth Ann's parents came there and were high, big shots in the community, etc., I think they were totally blurred. I think they knew it and they didn't know it. And I think that's one of the ills of this.
And personally, what Ken Watson was talking about yesterday with the money is certainly an issue, but there's also a feeling, I think, that adoption professionals have, particularly if they have birthed children, of guilt, that they hope that somehow in placing a child, they're taking care of these poor people who are less than and can't have. And children are not real. When placements occur in agencies with forms and charts and checklists and that whole, agency and independent adoption, the child becomes not a person. I thought when Danielle said she decided to become a person, I think that's a real job that adoptees have in a lot of ways, is to be a person in a system that doesn't really acknowledge adoptees' personhood. No, come ahead. Please.
I think it's in what you're saying about becoming a person. We can, and even when we are allowed to finally start becoming a person, when we make a connection, we still have so many things taken away from us that are all parts of our person. You know, our names, our birth certificates, our information, our rights, and it's a very difficult thing for an adoptee to be a person. All those years without making that connection, you know, you're floating, you're not identifying with how do you know who you are way in there? And how can, when abuse strikes, when things go on in a situation, how can you know, where do you get that power to stand up when you've been obliterated from, you know, like the first 6 days of my life, I wasn't
You didn't
there.
exist.
I did, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, it's very hard to stand up and to say, you know, like it was when you said, you know, I actually went to when you said you've retired, you know, I went to my adoptive parents recently and gave them my spiel, and I said the same thing. I stood there and I said, I have retired, and I'm through with this. And that, for me, I could never have done that without making the connections with my birth family and pulling the strength up. And I became open towards the type of abuse I had because I was adopted, because I hit on all those issues you were saying.
Mhm.
I took it. I mean, I had no strength to stand up and to say this is wrong. And then on top of that, all of society, through its uneducated points of view with adoption, was saying to me, oh, you're so lucky. Look how grateful you are. You know, these people took you, and no one else on the list was at home, and you know, you wouldn't have been anywhere. You know, you're so lucky. They're so wonderful. So I was so warped.
So you think
inside.
somehow what you're
This
getting
a
is
mother?
what you deserve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
While we're
wasn't-
talking about your birth family, we should acknowledge that your birth father is
Yeah.
also here. Jack is lending us all support up here front.
Yeah, taking strength for the next item in empowering fathers.
I think you were next.
It's really, I'm so overwhelmed with all the information the last day. It feels like I've been here weeks. But I was really identifying with what Elizabeth Ann was saying, because my mom, my adopted mother, is really abusive. And I hear just now when you were saying it, society says, oh, you know, you're the lucky one, you're the special one, you're the special child because we really wanted you. You know, we took you in our home, and it makes it seem like you're really ungrateful, and you're selfish, and you're self-centered, and you're terrible not to be so grateful for this home that you've been given. And it really is affecting me. And I just now talking about this, I remember my mom used to say, well, terrible things to me, how awful I was in it. But she said, I don't know why I ever adopted you two. I should never have adopted you kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I never knew how much that affected me. I mean, I never once cried about how she said that and what that, I mean, before my daughter was born 6 months ago, I thought issues with adoption, there weren't any issues. And it's all coming out, and my father's an alcoholic, although very social alcoholic, so. And I was telling him about coming to this and looking for my birth family, and he's like, he said, well, I understand your curiosity. You don't really want to find them, do you? I can understand you want information. And then he, said, well, other families have problems too. Now are you,
That's the famous one. Other families have problems, yeah.
And then I said to him, Dad, this is a dysfunctional family.
Mhm.
One thing, thanks for letting me spew for a minute. One thing I was interested in, and I don't know if you talked about it because I missed the first part, but my brother has like completely different reactions to adoption, and I'm just sort of telling him what I'm doing, and he's pretty distant, pretty much in denial a lot of times. But do you see, big differences between men and women adoptees, and what are those main differences? I don't know if you spoke about that.
I didn't speak about that here. We do see that, and I'm going to refer you to some of the other workshops because it's a complicated issue about men's issues. And if you just look around at how many women we always are at these conferences, I think that gives you some ideas. And in any family where there's abuse, even the same abuse, people react differently. And whether it's the genetic factors, whether it's the placement of the child, the time, I don't think we really know enough. But the reactions can be really different. Somebody
My
else.
sister won't address it.
Danny, I don't know whether you folks heard that.
My sister won't address it.
Won't
She
address it at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a female and she won't.
Yeah.
it's a taboo subject. You're not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, too painful. Over here.
When I see Sarah and Elizabeth Ann, I'm extremely envious because at least Elizabeth Ann passed Sarah. In my case, I had an abusive adoptive mother, but a deceased birth mother.
Oh.
So there's no one I can go to, and I have this mothering deficit. And try to figure out, well, shall I befriend some older woman and make her my ersatz mother? So I'm kind of at a loss.
You're really struggling with that. Yeah.
I can speak to that. I'm an incest survivor, and both my adopted parents are incest survivors. So this incest was perpetrated down my family, and it's a long generational incest survivors. Whatever. I did, and as I was growing up, because my adopted parents weren't there for me, I adopted people. I had, when I was about 3, we moved to a new neighborhood, or 4, I had, my best friend's mother was my second mother. And she mothered me, and she took care of me, and when things went crazy, and I mean absolutely crazy in my house, I'd go down to her house and pace in front of her yard and curse and carry on screaming. She'd bring me in and say, have some chicken soup, have a sandwich, talk. She'd put her arm around me. She was one of the people who helped me survive. I would not be alive today if it wasn't for my adopting these other people as my surrogate fathers or as my surrogate mothers, and having them be the role models for me, because I don't have any role models. I was told to get lost when the other 2 children were born. They were theirs. I was not. You know, and if there were money problems, and they were being supported by my grandparents, and when there wasn't enough food, it was, sorry, go to your room, no dinner for you. You know, because we need to feed these other 2. And so if it wasn't for those other surrogate people in my life, I now have a surrogate dad who I adopted. He's in Australia and I'm here, and we write and correspond and run up huge phone bills. I call him my dad by choice. And he feels like a father to me. He feels like a father that I never had in my life. And yes, it's a good thing to do. It's helped me progress. I would not be alive today, and I would have not gone through therapy. I would have gone through therapy if I hadn't had my daughter 7 years ago. I became afraid that I would continue that abuse. That terrified the hell out of me, that I would continue the abuse that went on in my family, the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, all that stuff. And so that really got me moving into therapy, but without all my surrogate family, I wouldn't be alive.
Thanks for sharing that, and I think that speaks to something that I'd like to sum up, and that is for all of us here, we are adults. That gives us some freedom. It also gives us some responsibility. You have to make a decision to heal. I hope that those of you who are in pain here today will make that decision and that choice. There are a lot of folks around this conference who would be happy to be surrogate moms, dads, brothers, and sisters. These are people who understand here. Please take the opportunity for 2 more things today. This afternoon's general session is going to be on sexual boundaries in adoption. You have a leg up on everybody else who will be coming to that session because we've begun our dialogue this morning and you've begun to think about. So I think you'll have a lot of things to offer in that setting, as well as in the triad support groups that are going to be held this afternoon. I think would be a great place. It's going to be sitting and sharing and supporting, a good place to talk with people who understand what your issues are. I want to particularly thank the panel for what they did in their sharing. We coordinated by phone and letters, and when it all came together, I am really grateful for each of you and what you did. And for you, you've been a wonderful audience. If you're hurting real bad, please grab somebody. This is not a place to walk around alone and in pain. Have a great day, and I'll see you later. If you can help with the surveys, take some, please.
This concludes this session.